The hammer fell from Sarah Mitchell's bloodied hands as she stared at the half-built cabin frame rising from the Wyoming prairie like the skeleton of a forgotten dream. 6 months ago, she had been a bride-to-be in a white dress, surrounded by well-wishers and promises of forever. Now she stood alone in buckskin and mud, her wedding ring long since traded for nails and timber, building with her own hands what no man had been willing to provide. What she didn't know was that someone had been watching her struggle from the distant ridge every single day, a cowboy whose own broken past had taught him to recognize the fierce determination of a soul that refused to surrender. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Sweetwater County, Wyoming, as Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell stood at the train platform, clutching a single carpet bag and wearing a travel dress that had once been her pride, but now bore the dust and wrinkles of a 3-day journey from St. Louis. She had come west to marry Thomas Brennan, a prosperous rancher who had courted her through letters filled with promises of a grand house, sprawling lands, and a future as bright as the Wyoming sky. Those letters, tied with blue ribbon and scented with lavender, had painted a picture of romance that had swept a young woman off her feet. Thomas had described vast herds of cattle, a 2-story ranch house with a wraparound porch, and a life of comfort and security that seemed like something from a dime novel. His photograph showed a handsome man with kind eyes and a confident smile, and his words spoke of loneliness that could only be cured by the right woman's love. Sarah had believed every word. The reality that greeted her in Sweetwater Station was far different from the fairy tale she had imagined. The town was little more than a collection of weathered buildings scattered along a dusty main street, with more saloons than churches and more tumbleweeds than people. The train station was a simple platform with a small depot building that looked like it might blow away in the next strong wind. She waited on that platform for 3 hours, her excitement gradually turning to concern and then to growing dread. Other passengers came and went, freight was loaded and unloaded, and the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, but no handsome rancher appeared to claim his bride. The station master, a grizzled man named Pete Dawson, finally approached her. With obvious reluctance. "You wouldn't be Miss Sarah Mitchell, would you?" he asked, his weathered face creased with what might have been sympathy or embarrassment. "I am," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. "I'm here to meet Thomas Brennan. He was supposed to meet the noon train." Pete removed his hat and ran his fingers through his thinning hair. "Miss, I'm afraid I got some news that ain't gonna sit well with you. Tom Brennan ... Well, he got married to Jenny Patterson last week. Big ceremony at the church and everything. They're honeymooning down in Denver right about now." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at the old man's face and hope she had misunderstood. But the sympathy in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. Thomas Brennan, the man who had promised to love and cherish her forever, had married someone else while she was traveling across half the country to become his wife. "But the letters," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He wrote to me just 2 weeks ago. He said he was counting the days until I arrived." Pete's discomfort was obvious as he shifted from foot to foot. "I don't know anything about letters, miss. All I know is what I see with my own eyes. Tom and Jenny have been keeping company for months now. Folks in town have been expecting them to marry for some time." Sarah felt the world spinning around her as the implications of her situation became clear. She was stranded in a strange town, 1,500 miles from home, with no money for a return ticket and nowhere to go. Everything she owned was in the single carpetbag at her feet, and her life savings had been spent on the journey west and the modest trousseau she had assembled for her new life as a rancher's wife. Is there a hotel?" She managed to ask, though she already suspected what the answer would be. "The Sweetwater Inn," Pete said, pointing down the street toward a building that looked like it had seen better days sometime during the previous decade. "But I gotta warn you, miss, it ain't exactly what you'd call suitable for a lady. Most folks who stay there are cowboys and drifters, and the beds ain't much more than rope and canvas." Sarah straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Dawson. I suppose I'd better go see a room." The walk down Sweetwater Station's main street was one of the longest of Sarah's life. Every eye seemed to be on her. Every whispered conversation seemed to be about her situation. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by now everyone would know about the bride who had come to marry a man who had already taken another wife. The Sweetwater Inn was indeed everything Pete Dawson had warned her about, and worse. The lobby smelled of stale tobacco and unwashed bodies. The floor was covered with sawdust and questionable stains, and the man behind the desk looked like he hadn't seen soap and water in recent memory. But it was a shelter, and Sarah was in no position to be particular. "Room's 50 cents a night," the clerk said, looking her up and down with obvious curiosity. "Payment in advance. No cooking in the rooms, and any entertaining of gentlemen callers requires an extra fee." Sarah paid for 3 nights, hoping that would give her enough time to figure out what to do next. The room was on the 2nd floor, reached by a staircase that creaked ominously with each step. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked mirror, and a single window that looked out over the alley behind the building. It was the furthest thing from the comfortable ranch house she had imagined, but it was hers for the moment. That first night, Sarah lay on the thin mattress and allowed herself to cry for the dreams that had been shattered and the future that had been stolen from her. She thought about the life she had left behind in St. Louis, the comfortable boarding house where she had worked as a seamstress, the friends who had envied her romantic adventure, the steady if unexciting routine that had seemed so confining just a week ago. But as the night wore on and her tears finally dried, something else began to grow in their place. It started as a small spark of anger at Thomas Brennan's deception, but it quickly became something larger and more powerful. Sarah Mitchell had not traveled 1,500 miles and spent her life savings to give up at the first setback. She would find a way to survive, to build something for herself in this harsh land, and to prove that she didn't need a faithless man's promises to make a life worth living. The next morning, Sarah put on her most practical dress and set out to explore Sweetwater Station more thoroughly. The town was bigger than she had initially thought, with several businesses scattered alongside streets that weren't visible from the train platform. There was a general store, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and even a one-room schoolhouse that looked like it had been built recently. At the general store, she met Martha Henderson, a middle-aged woman who ran the business with her husband Jake. Martha was the first person in town to show Sarah genuine kindness, offering her a cup of coffee and listening to her story with sympathetic ears. "That Tom Brennan always was a weak-willed fool," Martha said bluntly when Sarah finished explaining her situation. "Jenny Patterson's daddy owns the biggest spread in 3 counties, and I suspect that had more to do with Tom's choice than any great love affair. What am I going to do?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her since she learned of Thomas's betrayal. "I don't have enough money to get home, and I don't know anyone here." Martha studied her for a long moment, taking in Sarah's determined posture and the steady way she met her gaze. "You could go home, if that's what you really want. Jake and I might be able to help you scrape together the train fare. But you could also stay and make something of yourself here. Lord knows we need more good people in this town." "Stay and do what?" Sarah asked. "I'm a seamstress, but I don't see much call for fancy dresses in Sweetwater Station. There's other kinds of work for a woman who's not afraid to get her hands dirty," Martha replied. "Cooking, cleaning, teaching school. Or you could homestead, if you've got the grit for it. The government's giving away land to anyone willing to work it. The idea of homesteading intrigued Sarah more than she expected. She had grown up on a small farm in Missouri before her family moved to the city, and she remembered the satisfaction of growing things and building with her own hands. But the thought of doing it alone, without a husband's strength and protection, seemed almost impossible. A woman alone? Sarah asked, "Is such a thing even possible?" "It ain't easy," Martha admitted, "but it's been done. There's a widow named Beth Crawford who's been working a claim about 20 miles north of here for 3 years now. She's doing well enough to come to town for supplies regular-like." That afternoon, Sarah walked to the edge of town and looked out at the vast expanse of prairie that stretched to the horizon. The land was beautiful in its own stark way, with rolling hills covered in native grass that moved like waves in the constant wind. She could imagine a small house nestled in one of those valleys, with a garden and maybe a few chickens, and the kind of independence that no faithless man could ever take away. But imagination was one thing, and reality was another. Homesteading required money for supplies, tools for building and farming, and knowledge that Sarah wasn't sure she possessed. Most daunting of all, it required the kind of physical strength and endurance that she had never needed in her previous life as a city seamstress. Over the next several days, Sarah made inquiries around town about homesteading opportunities and requirements. She learned that the Homestead Act entitled any citizen, including unmarried women, to claim 160 acres of public land, provided they lived on it and improved it for 5 years. The land office was in Cheyenne, a day's ride away, but claims could be filed by mail with the proper documentation. She also learned about the practical requirements of frontier life from conversations with other women in town. Building a cabin required not just lumber and nails, but knowledge of construction techniques that few women possessed. Farming required not just seeds and tools, but understanding of soil and weather that came from years of experience. And surviving alone on the frontier required a kind of mental and physical toughness that was foreign to most women of her background. Despite these daunting challenges, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn to the idea of homesteading. It represented everything that Thomas Brennan's promises had failed to deliver: independence, security, and the satisfaction of building something lasting with her own hands. More importantly, it offered her a chance to prove to herself and the world that Sarah Mitchell was more than just a discarded bride waiting for another man to rescue her. The decision crystallized one evening as she sat in her dingy hotel room, calculating and recalculating her meager finances. She had enough money to return to St. Louis, but just barely, and she would arrive there with nothing but the clothes on her back and the humiliation of her failed romance. Alternatively, she could spend that same money on homesteading supplies and take her chances on building a new life from scratch. The next morning, Sarah walked into Martha Henderson's store with her mind made up. "I want to file a homestead claim," she announced. "Can you help me understand what I'll need?" Martha's face lit up with approval and perhaps a little admiration. "Now that's the spirit that built this country," she said. "Let's sit down and make a list." Over the next hour, Martha helped Sarah understand the practical requirements of establishing a homestead. She would need basic tools: an axe, a saw, a hammer, and nails for construction. She would need a rifle for protection and hunting, and ammunition to go with it. She would need seed for a garden, basic cooking utensils, and enough food supplies to last until her first harvest. Most importantly, she would need lumber for building a cabin that would satisfy the government's requirements for permanent improvement of the land. The list was daunting, and the costs were substantial. Even buying the cheapest available tools and supplies would consume most of Sarah's remaining money, leaving her with no safety net if things went wrong. But Martha's enthusiasm was infectious, and Sarah found herself getting caught up in the planning process. "There's good land available about 10 miles southeast of town," Martha said, spreading a hand-drawn map across the store counter. "It's got a creek running through it, which means water year-round. And there's enough timber along the creek bank to give you building material without having to buy it all." Sarah studied the map, trying to imagine herself living in such an isolated spot. 10 miles from town meant a 2-hour walk each way, assuming good weather and clear trails. In winter or during storms, she might be completely cut off from civilization for days or weeks at a time. "What about neighbors?" she asked. "Would I be completely alone out there?" "There's a few other homesteaders scattered around that area," Martha replied. "The closest would be the Walker family, about 3 miles to the north. Good people, from what I hear. And there's been talk of someone working a claim up on the ridge overlooking the valley, though I ain't never met whoever it is." The mention of other settlers nearby was reassuring, though Sarah wondered what kind of help she could realistically expect from neighbors who were struggling to establish their own homesteads. Still, knowing that other people had chosen to build their lives in that area suggested that it was at least possible to survive there. That evening, Sarah made her final decision. She would file her homestead claim, purchase the basic supplies she needed, and set out to build a new life with her own hands. It was the most frightening and exciting decision she had ever made, and as she fell asleep in her narrow hotel bed, she dreamed of a small cabin nestled beside a creek, with smoke rising from its chimney and the satisfaction of absolute independence filling her heart. What Sarah didn't know, as she made her plans and gathered her courage, was that someone had been watching Sweetwater Station with the kind of attention that suggested more than casual interest. High on a ridge overlooking the town, a lone figure sat his horse in the pre-dawn darkness, studying the buildings below through field glasses with the patience of a man who had learned that observation often revealed more than action. The rider was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his adult life under the open sky. His clothes were practical rather than decorative worn leather chaps, a faded blue shirt, and a hat that had seen better days, but still kept the sun out of his eyes. 2 things marked him as different from the typical drifting cowboy: the quality of his horse, a magnificent black stallion that spoke of careful breeding and expert training, and the deliberate way he positioned himself to observe without being observed. He had been watching the town for 3 days now, ever since word had reached him about the abandoned bride who was asking questions about homesteading. The story had traveled the way all interesting news traveled on the frontier, from ranch to ranch, salon to saloon, carried by cowboys and traveling merchants who understood that information was often more valuable than gold. The watcher's interest in Sarah Mitchell's situation was more than idle curiosity. He had his own reasons for paying attention to anyone who chose to settle in the valley below. Reasons that went back to promises made and debts that could only be repaid through vigilance. But as he watched the small figure of a woman moving through the town below, making her preparations and gathering her courage, he found himself feeling something he hadn't experienced in years: hope that someone else might succeed where he had failed. As the sun rose over the Wyoming hills, casting long shadows across the prairie, both Sarah Mitchell and her unknown watcher prepared for changes that would alter the course of both their lives. She was planning to build something new from the ashes of her broken dreams, while he was continuing a vigil that had consumed 3 years of his life. Neither of them could have imagined how their paths would intertwine, or how the simple act of raising a cabin roof would become the foundation for something far more valuable than either had dared to hope for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they rolled across the Wyoming prairie, carrying Sarah Mitchell toward what she hoped would become her new home. Jake Henderson sat beside her on the driver's bench, his weathered hands steady on the reins as he guided the team of oxen over the rough trail. Behind them, The wagon bed was loaded with everything Sarah had been able to afford: lumber, tools, a small iron stove, sacks of flour and beans, and the precious rifle that Martha had insisted she learn to use. "That creek up ahead marks the start of your section," Jake said, pointing toward a line of cottonwoods that snaked across the landscape like a green ribbon. "Pretty spot, from what I remember. Haven't been out this way in near 2 years, but the land should be just like Martha described." Sarah shaded her eyes against the morning sun, trying to make out details of the terrain ahead. The valley looked peaceful enough, with rolling hills covered in buffalo grass and the promise of water from the creek. But she was beginning to understand the difference between looking at land and actually living on it. What appeared beautiful from a distance might prove harsh and unforgiving up close. The past week had been a whirlwind of preparation and learning. Martha Henderson had taken Sarah under her wing like a determined mother hen, teaching her everything from how to load and fire the rifle to the basics of cabin construction. Jake had contributed his own expertise, showing Sarah how to handle and act safely and explaining the importance of choosing the right spot for building. "You want high ground for the cabin," he had explained while they practiced behind the store. "High enough to stay dry when the creek floods, but close enough to water that you ain't carrying buckets half a mile every day. And you want the door facing south if possible, so you get the most sun in winter." Sarah had absorbed every lesson eagerly, knowing that her survival might depend on remembering these details. She had also spent considerable time learning to handle the rifle, despite her initial reluctance to carry a weapon. Martha had been blunt about the necessity. "A woman alone out there faces more than just wild animals," she had said during one of their practice sessions. "There's men who think an unprotected woman is fair game for whatever they got in mind. That rifle ain't just for hunting rabbits." The implications of that warning had kept Sarah awake more than one night, but she refused to let fear change her mind. She had committed herself to this course of action, and she would see it through regardless of the dangers. Now, as the wagon approached her future homestead, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror that made her stomach flutter like a cage full of butterflies. In a few hours, Jake would head back to town, leaving her alone in the wilderness with nothing but her own determination and the skills she had hurriedly acquired over the past week. The creek was larger than she had expected, perhaps 20 feet wide and running clear over a bed of smooth stones. Cottonwoods and willows grew thick along its banks, providing both shade and a ready source of building material. The land on either side rose gently away from the water, creating natural terraces. That would be perfect for a cabin site and garden. "This'll do nicely," Jake said approvingly as he guided the wagon to a stop on a level spot about 100 yards from the creek. "Good drainage, close to water, and enough trees to give you all the lumber you'll need for building and firewood." Both. Sarah climbed down from the wagon seat and walked slowly around the area, trying to envision her future home. The silence was profound after the constant noise of town life. No rattling wagons, no shouting voices, no barking dogs. Just the whisper of wind through grass and the gentle murmur of water over stones. "Quiet out here," she said, more to break the silence than because it needed commenting on. "You'll get used to it," Jake replied as he began unloading her supplies. "Might even come to prefer it after a while. Town noise can wear on a person." They spent the rest of the morning establishing what Jake called her base camp, a simple arrangement of canvas tarps, stretched between trees to provide shelter while she built more permanent structures. Her supplies were stacked and covered with waterproof canvas, and a fire ring was built from creek stones for cooking. "First thing you need to do is get that cabin started," Jake advised as they shared a lunch of cold biscuits and bacon. "You got maybe 6 weeks of good building weather before winter sets in serious. After that, you'll be depending on this shelter to keep you alive." The urgency in his voice was not lost on Sarah. She had known intellectually that time was important. But seeing the reality of her situation laid out so starkly was sobering. 6 weeks to build a cabin from scratch, using skills she had barely begun to learn. The magnitude of the challenge was almost overwhelming. What if I can't finish in time? She asked quietly. Jake studied her face carefully before answering. Then you spend the winter in town and try again come spring. Ain't no shame in recognizing when you're beat, as long as you don't give up permanent-like. After Jake departed in the early afternoon, taking with him the last connection to civilization, Sarah stood alone in her valley and tried to quiet the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. The silence that had seemed peaceful earlier now felt oppressive, and every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. She forced herself to focus on immediate practical concerns. Following Jake's advice, she spent the remainder of the daylight hours scouting the area around her camp, looking for the best location for her cabin. The spot needed to meet all the criteria she had learned: high ground, southern exposure, proximity to water, and access to building materials. She finally settled on a gentle rise about 50 yards from the creek, where a cluster of large boulders would provide a natural foundation for one wall of the cabin. The location offered a commanding view of the valley while being sheltered from the prevailing winds by a grove of cottonwoods. That first night alone was the longest of Sarah's life. Every sound made her jump: the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the grass, the crack of settling wood in her fire. She kept the rifle close beside her bedroll and found herself checking the loads repeatedly. Even though she knew perfectly well the weapon was ready to fire, sleep came fitfully, and was filled with dreams of wolves and wild men and cabins that collapsed before they could be completed. She woke before dawn, stiff and exhausted, but grimly determined to begin the work that would determine whether she survived or failed. The first task was clearing the cabin site. Sarah had never wielded an axe for any serious purpose, but she attacked the job with desperate energy, chopping down the smaller trees and brush that occupied her chosen building spot. The work was harder than she had imagined. The axe was heavier than it looked, and accurate placement of the blade required coordination she hadn't yet developed. By midday, she had managed to clear an area roughly 20 feet square, though her hands were blistered and her shoulders ached fiercely. She took a break to eat and tend to her injuries, wrapping her hands with strips of cloth to prevent the blisters from becoming worse. The afternoon was spent dragging the fallen trees to the creek, where she could strip off the branches and begin the process of preparing logs for construction. This work proved even more difficult than the clearing. The logs were heavier than she had anticipated, and moving them without a horse or oxen required techniques she was still learning. As the sun set on her first full day as a homesteader, Sarah surveyed her progress with mixed emotions. The cleared site looked pitifully small compared to the cabin she envisioned, and the few logs she had prepared seemed inadequate for any serious construction. At this rate, it would take her months rather than weeks to complete her shelter. But she had made a start, and that was something. More importantly, she had survived her first day alone and proven to herself that she could do physical work she had never imagined attempting. The blisters on her hands and the aches in her muscles were badges of accomplishment rather than sources of complaint. The second day brought new challenges and small victories. Sarah's technique with the axe improved noticeably as she developed a rhythm and learned to let the weight of the tool do most of the work. She managed to clear additional area around her cabin site and prepare several more logs for construction. More importantly, she began to develop the mental toughness that frontier life demanded. The silence no longer seemed threatening, and she found herself paying attention to the natural rhythms of her environment, the patterns of bird calls that indicated the time of day, the subtle changes in wind direction that preceded weather changes, the tracks in the creek mud that told her what animals shared her valley. It was during her third day of work that Sarah first became aware she was not alone in the wilderness. She was taking a midday break, sitting in the shade of her supply tarp and eating a simple meal of hardtack and jerky, when something made her look up toward the ridge that overlooked her valley. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the familiar line of hills against the blue sky. But as she watched, a small movement caught her eye. A rider sat motionless on the ridgeline, barely visible at such a distance, but definitely there. As soon as she focused on the figure, it disappeared, melting back into the landscape as if it had never existed. Sarah sat very still for several minutes, studying the ridge and wondering if she had imagined the whole thing. Isolation could play tricks on the mind, she knew, and she might simply have mistaken a tree or rock formation for a human figure. But something about the way the shape had moved and then vanished suggested deliberate concealment rather than optical illusion. The knowledge that someone might be watching her was both frightening and oddly comforting. Frightening because she had no way of knowing whether the watcher was friend or enemy, but comforting because it meant she was not as completely alone as she had believed. She found herself glancing toward the ridge repeatedly as she worked that afternoon, but she saw no further sign of the mysterious rider. Still, the feeling of being observed persisted, and she made sure to keep her rifle close at hand as she went about her tasks. That evening, as she sat beside her fire eating a supper of beans and bacon, Sarah made a decision that would have surprised her former self. Instead of cowering in her shelter and worrying about unknown watchers, she would continue with her work and trust in her own growing competence to handle whatever challenges arose. The mysterious rider, if he existed, had made no move to approach or threaten her. Perhaps he was simply another homesteader keeping an eye on his new neighbor, or a passing cowboy who had paused to rest his horse. In either case, worrying about him would accomplish nothing except to undermine her own confidence. Over the following days, Sarah settled into a routine that would have been unimaginable to her just weeks earlier. She rose before dawn, rekindled her fire, and prepared a simple breakfast while coffee boiled in her battered pot. After eating, she would spend the morning hours on the heaviest work felling trees, preparing logs, and gradually accumulating the materials she would need for construction. The midday heat was too intense for heavy labor, so she used those hours for lighter tasks, mending her clothes, cleaning her rifle, writing letters she would never send to friends back in St. Louis. The afternoons were devoted to the actual construction work, laying foundation stones and beginning the careful process of fitting logs together into walls. Her technique improved daily, and what had seemed impossible during her first few days gradually became merely difficult. The blisters on her hands hardened into calluses, her shoulders adapted to the weight of the axe, and her eye learned to judge the grain of wood and the best way to split or shape each piece. More importantly, her confidence grew with each small success. The first time she managed to fell a tree exactly where she intended, landing it with a crash that echoed across the valley, she felt a surge of pride that was entirely new to her experience. This was accomplishment of a different sort than any she had known in her previous life, physical, immediate, and completely dependent on her own skill and determination. The mysterious watcher continued to make occasional appearances on the ridge, always at a distance and never for very long. Sarah had come to think of him as a guardian spirit of sorts, watching over her efforts without interfering. Whether this was wishful thinking or accurate assessment, she could not say, but the idea gave her comfort during the long hours of solitary work. By the end of her first week alone, Sarah had made remarkable progress. The foundation of her cabin was laid out in carefully fitted stones, and she had prepared enough logs to begin the actual wall construction. More importantly, she had proven to herself that Sarah Mitchell was made of sterner stuff than anyone, including herself, had ever suspected. As she sat by her fire that evening, planning the next day's work and feeling the pleasant ache of muscles well used, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in such a short time. A month ago, she had been a pampered city woman whose Greatest challenge was threading a needle or managing a difficult customer at the dress shop. Now she was wielding an axe like a frontiersman and planning the construction of a building with her own hands. The transformation was far from complete. She still had enormous challenges ahead of her, and winter was approaching with relentless certainty. But she had made a beginning, and that beginning had revealed strengths she had never known she possessed. Tomorrow she would begin raising the walls of her cabin, and with them, the foundation of her new life as an independent woman of the frontier. The abandoned bride was becoming something else entirely, a pioneer, a builder, and a woman who had learned that the only rescue worth having was the one you provided for yourself. The morning mist clung to the creek, like ghostly fingers as Sarah Mitchell hefted her first wall log into position. 3 weeks had passed since Jake Henderson had left her alone in the valley, and the foundation stones of her cabin now supported the beginnings of what would become her winter shelter. The work had been brutally difficult, but each day brought visible progress and a growing sense of accomplishment that made the aching muscles and bleeding hands worthwhile. She had developed a system for the heavy construction work, using a combination of leverage, rope, and sheer determination to move logs that would have required 2 strong men under normal circumstances. A series of wooden rollers allowed her to transport the larger timbers from the creek to her building site, while a primitive pulley system rigged between 2 sturdy cottonwoods helped her lift the wall logs into position. The cabin was taking shape according to the plan Jake had helped her sketch out, a simple rectangle 20 feet long by 16 feet wide, with a stone fireplace on the north wall and a single door facing south toward the creek. 2 small windows would provide light and ventilation, their openings carefully measured to accommodate the glass panes she had purchased in town. Sarah paused in her work to wipe sweat from her forehead and survey her progress. The walls stood nearly 4 feet high now, the carefully notched logs fitting together with increasing precision as her skills improved. At this rate, she might actually complete the structure before the first serious snowfall, though she knew the roof would present challenges that would make the wall construction seem simple by comparison. A sound from the direction of the creek made her look up sharply, her hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that was never far from her side. 3 riders were approaching along the stream bank, their horses picking their way carefully through the rocky terrain. Even at a distance, something about their manner suggested they were not friendly neighbors coming to welcome the new settler. Sarah quickly climbed down from her construction platform and checked the load in her rifle, grateful for the hours Martha Henderson had forced her to spend practicing with the weapon. The riders were still several hundred yards away, but they were definitely heading toward her homestead with what appeared to be deliberate purpose. As they drew closer, Sarah could make out more details. The 3 men were rough-looking characters, with the hard edges that came from lives spent on the wrong side of the law. Their leader was a big man with a black beard and cruel eyes, while his companions had the nervous energy of men accustomed to violence. None of them bore any resemblance to honest cowboys or neighboring homesteaders. "Well, well," the bearded man called out as they rode into Sarah's clearing. "What have we got here?" Little lady playing house in the middle of nowhere. Sarah stood her ground, holding her rifle in a ready position without pointing it directly at the intruders. "Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and this is my homestead. Can I help you with something?" The leader laughed, a sound devoid of any genuine humor. "Help us? Oh, honey, I think it's us who's gonna help you. Name's Bull Garrett, and these are my associates, Snake Wilson and Coyote Pete. We was just riding through when we seen your little building project here." Sarah's blood chilled at the mention of Bull Garrett's name. She had heard whispers about him in town, a notorious outlaw who preyed on isolated settlers and travelers, taking what he wanted and leaving destruction in his wake. The fact that he had found her homestead was the worst possible development she could have imagined. "I appreciate your interest, Mr. Garrett, But I'm doing fine on my own, Sarah said, proud that her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. I'm sure you have business elsewhere that requires your attention. Bull's grin widened, revealing yellowed teeth. Oh, but that's where you're wrong, little lady. See, we've been watching you work out here for days now, and we got to thinking a woman alone, building herself a nice little cabin, probably got some money saved up for supplies and such. Seems to us like you could use some protection from all the dangerous characters that might wander through these parts. The threat was thinly veiled, but perfectly clear. Sarah had heard of such schemes before, outlaws who demanded protection money from isolated settlers, threatening to become the very danger they claimed to guard against if payment was not forthcoming. I don't need protection, Sarah replied firmly, and I don't have money to spare for unnecessary services. Snake Wilson, a thin man with pale eyes and a nervous habit of constantly moving, spoke up for the first time. See, Bull, I told you this one would be trouble. Uppity city girl. Thinks she's too good for honest working men. Honest working men. Sarah couldn't keep the scorn out of her voice. Is that what you call yourselves? Bull's expression darkened at her tone. You got a smart mouth on you, lady. That's gonna need fixing before we can do business. He dismounted from his horse with casual arrogance, clearly not considering Sarah's rifle a serious threat. I think you gentlemen should move along, Sarah said, raising her weapon to a more threatening position. I have work to do, and you're trespassing on my land. Your land? Coyote Pete laughed, revealing a mouthful of broken teeth. Lady, this here's the territory. Land belongs to whoever's strong enough to hold it. And I don't see how one woman with a rifle she probably don't even know how to use is gonna hold much of anything. Bull continued his approach, apparently confident that Sarah wouldn't actually shoot. Now here's how this is gonna work. You're gonna pay us $50 a month for protection, plus whatever supplies we need when we're in the area. In return, we make sure nothing bad happens to your little homestead here. And if I refuse? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Well then, unfortunate accidents start happening, Bull replied with mock sympathy. Fires, mostly. Amazing how fast a half-built cabin can burn, especially when it's been soaked with coal oil first. Sarah felt a cold rage building in her chest. She had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let these parasites destroy everything she was building. Get off my land, she said quietly, her voice carrying a finality that made Bull pause in his advance. Now, honey, you don't want to do nothing stupid, he said, but his tone had changed slightly. Perhaps he was beginning to recognize that the woman facing him was not the helpless victim he had expected. The only stupid thing I see is 3 grown men trying to steal from a woman who's done nothing but work hard for what she has, Sarah replied. Last warning, get off my property. Bull's face flushed red with anger. You know what? I changed my mind about the protection money. I think we'll just take what we want and burn the rest. Boys, let's show this uppity bitch what happens when she don't show proper respect. The 3 outlaws began to spread out, clearly planning to rush her from multiple directions. Sarah realized that the moment for negotiation had passed, if it had ever existed at all. These men had come here with violence in mind, and nothing she could say would change their intentions. She chose her target carefully, aiming for Bull Garrett's center mass just as Martha Henderson had taught her. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with a roar that echoed across the valley, and Bull stumbled backward with a look of complete surprise on his face. The bullet had taken him high in the chest, and he collapsed beside his horse with blood spreading across his shirt. Snake Wilson cursed and went for his gun, but Sarah was already working the rifle's lever action, chambering a fresh round with the smooth efficiency that came from countless hours of practice. Her second shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying into the grass. Coyote Pete, Seeing his two companions down and faced with a woman who was proving to be a far more dangerous opponent than anticipated, decided that discretion was the better part of valor. He wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the creek. Abandoning his wounded comrades in his haste to escape, Sarah kept her rifle trained on the fleeing outlaw until he disappeared into the trees along the creek bank, then turned her attention to the two men on the ground. Bull Garrett was clearly dying, his breath coming in shallow gasps as blood pooled beneath him. Snake Wilson was wounded but alive, clutching his shoulder and cursing steadily. "You crazy bitch," Wilson snarled through gritted teeth. "You got any idea what you just done? Bull's got friends all over this territory. They'll burn you out for sure now." Sarah walked over to where Wilson's gun had fallen and kicked it well out of his reach. "They can try," she said calmly, "but they'll find out the same thing you just learned. I don't scare easy, and I sure don't run from bullies." She retrieved rope from her supplies and bound Wilson's good arm to his injured one, ignoring his protests and threats. "You're going to sit right there while I decide what to do with you," she informed him. "And if you try to run, I'll put the next bullet somewhere that will make you wish I'd aimed better the first time." With Wilson secured, Sarah turned her attention to Bull Garrett, who was clearly beyond any help she might provide. The outlaw leader's eyes were glazed with approaching death, but he managed to focus on her face one last time. "This ain't over," he whispered. "Coyote Pete, he'll bring back the whole gang, you're dead, lady." Bull Garrett breathed his last with those words, leaving Sarah alone with one wounded prisoner and the certain knowledge that more trouble was coming. She had won this battle, but the war for her homestead was just beginning. The afternoon sun was climbing toward its peak when Sarah heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats once again. Her heart sank as she realized that Coyote Pete had returned much sooner than expected, probably bringing reinforcements just as Bull had threatened. She checked her rifle and took position behind her partially completed cabin wall, preparing for what might be her final stand. But as the rider came into view, Sarah realized with surprise that it was not Coyote Pete or additional outlaws. A single horseman approached at an easy pace, sitting his magnificent black stallion with the confidence of a man who feared neither beast nor human. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years under the open sky, and he carried himself with a quiet authority that commanded attention. The stranger reined in his horse at the edge of Sarah's clearing and touched the brim of his hat in polite greeting. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent that spoke of genteel origins. "Heard gunfire from up on the ridge. Thought I'd ride down and see if you might be in need of assistance." Sarah kept her rifle ready but lowered it slightly. "Are you the one who's been watching me from the ridge line?" she asked directly. The man smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered features into something almost boyish. "Guilty as charged, I'm afraid. Name's Daniel Crawford, and I've been keeping an eye on this valley for some time now. Couldn't help but notice you've been building yourself quite a fine cabin." "Daniel Crawford," Sarah repeated, trying to place where she had heard that name before. Then she remembered Martha Henderson had mentioned a Crawford who owned property in the area. "Any relation to Beth Crawford, the widow who homesteads north of here?" Daniel's expression grew sad. "My sister-in-law. My brother died 3 years ago, and I've been watching over her place ever since. She doesn't know it. Of course, Beth's proud as Lucifer and wouldn't accept help if she was starving. But a woman alone needs someone looking out for her, whether she admits it or not." The explanation made sense, and Sarah found herself relaxing slightly. "Well, Mr. Crawford, as you can see, I've had some visitors who weren't entirely welcome." She gestured toward Bull Garrett's body and the bound Snake Wilson. Daniel dismounted and examined the scene with the practiced eye of someone familiar with violence. "Bull Garrett," he said after studying the dead man's face, "I'd say you did the territory a favor by putting him down, ma'am. Man was a plague on decent folks. His friend there says the gang will come back for revenge," Sarah said, nodding. toward Wilson, who was glaring at both of them with undisguised hatred. "Snake's probably right about that," Daniel agreed calmly. "Bull rode with a crew of 8 or 10 men, all of them meaner than sin and twice as dangerous. They'll take this personal, especially since it was a woman who killed their leader." The confirmation of her fears sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but she refused to let it show. "Then I guess I'd better finish my cabin and get ready for them." Daniel studied her for a long moment, clearly impressed by her calm determination in the face of such a threat. "Ma'am, I don't mean to question your courage. What you did here today took more sand than most men possess. But facing down Bull's whole gang by yourself would be suicide, plain and simple." "What choice do I have?" Sarah asked. "This is my land, my home. I won't be driven off by a bunch of outlaws who think they can take whatever they want." "You could come stay with my sister-in-law until this blows over," Daniel suggested. "Or head back to town until the law can deal with the situation." Sarah shook her head firmly. "I left town to build something of my own, Mr. Crawford. If I run every time things get difficult, I'll never have anything worth keeping." Daniel nodded slowly, recognizing the steel in her voice. "I understand that feeling, ma'am, I truly do. But sometimes tactical retreat is the better part of valor." "Maybe for some people," Sarah replied, "but not for me. I've run from one man's betrayal already. I won't run from another man's threats." The reference to betrayal sparked curiosity in Daniel's eyes, but he was too much of a gentleman to pry into personal matters uninvited. Instead, he looked around at her half-completed cabin and the evidence of weeks of backbreaking labor. "You've done remarkable work here," he said admiringly. "Most men would have given up after the first week of building alone." "Most men don't have to prove they're capable of taking care of themselves," Sarah replied. "I do." Daniel was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with some internal debate. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "Ma'am, I've got a proposition for you. What if I was to help you finish this cabin before Bull's gang shows up? 2 people working together could get it done a lot faster than one person working alone." Sarah stared at him in surprise. "Why would you do that?" "You don't even know me." "Let's just say I have my reasons," Daniel replied cryptically. "And I'd rather see you succeed here than watch another good person get driven off their land by scum like Bull Garrett's crew." The offer was tempting more than tempting. With Daniel's help, she might actually complete her cabin in time to have a defensible position when the outlaws returned. But accepting help would mean admitting that she couldn't handle everything alone, and that admission felt like failure to her stubborn pride. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Crawford, but I need to do this myself," she said finally. Daniel nodded as if he had expected that answer. "I understand, ma'am. But the offer stands if you change your mind. In the meantime, what do you want to do?" "About Snake there?" Sarah looked at her prisoner, who had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm. The wounded outlaw clearly understood that his situation was precarious, and the mention of his gang's planned revenge had made him realize that he might not live to see it. "I suppose I should take him to town and turn him over to the sheriff," she said reluctantly. "That would be the proper thing to do," Daniel agreed. "Course, it means leaving your..." The dilemma was clear. She couldn't leave her property unguarded, but she couldn't keep a wounded prisoner indefinitely either. As she pondered her options, Sarah began to realize that her determination to handle everything alone might have to give way to practical necessity. The sun was setting behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, when Sarah finally made her decision. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, not with winter approaching and an outlaw gang planning revenge. "Mr. Crawford," she said quietly, "I believe I'd like to reconsider your offer of help." Daniel smiled and tipped his hat. "Yes, ma'am, I thought you might." Dawn broke crisp and clear over the Wyoming Valley, bringing with it the sound of 2 axes working in perfect rhythm. Daniel Crawford had arrived before sunrise, true to his word, and the partnership that Sarah Mitchell had reluctantly accepted was already proving its worth. What had taken her days to accomplish alone, they were completing in hours working together. "Timber," Daniel called out as another cottonwood crashed to the earth, its fall precisely calculated to land near their growing pile of building materials. Sarah had to admit that watching him work was both humbling and impressive. His movements were economical and sure, born of years spent working with his hands in conditions that demanded efficiency. "You make that look easy," Sarah said during a brief rest. Wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cool morning air, Daniel smiled as he ran his hand along the fallen tree, assessing its potential as building material. "Practice makes the difference. I've put up more cabins than I care to count over the years. Course, most times I had a crew of men helping instead of." He paused, suddenly aware that his words might sound condescending. "Instead of a stubborn woman who insists on doing everything the hard way." Sarah finished with a wry smile. "It's all right, Mr. Crawford. I know I'm not the ideal building partner." "Actually, you're wrong about that," Daniel said seriously. "I've worked with plenty of men who couldn't match your determination or attention to detail. Most folks want to rush through the hard parts, but you take the time to do things right the first time." The compliment pleased Sarah more than she cared to admit. Over the past weeks of solitary work, she had begun to doubt her own competence, second-guessing every decision and wondering if she was making fundamental mistakes that would doom her efforts. Having someone with Daniel's obvious expertise validate her methods was deeply reassuring. They worked through the morning in companionable efficiency, falling into a natural rhythm that maximized their productivity. Daniel handled the heaviest work, felling trees and preparing the larger structural timbers, while Sarah focused on the precision tasks that required patience rather than raw strength. Together, they accomplished more in 3 hours than she had managed in her best full day working alone. During their midday break, sharing a simple meal of bread and preserved meat beside the creek, Sarah found herself studying her new partner with curious eyes. Daniel Crawford was not what she had expected when she first noticed someone watching her from the ridge. She had imagined either a threat to be feared or a lonely hermit to be pitied. But Daniel was clearly neither. He carried himself with quiet confidence and spoke with the educated accent of someone who had received formal schooling. Yet his hands bore the calluses of hard physical labor, and his weathered features spoke of years spent under the open sky. Most intriguingly, there was a sadness in his gray eyes that suggested personal tragedy. Though he had revealed nothing of his history beyond his relationship to Beth Crawford. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Crawford?" Sarah said as they rested in the shade of her supply tarp. "Daniel, please. And yes, you may ask, though I reserve the right not to answer. Why are you really helping me? And don't say it's just out of neighborly kindness. I may be new to frontier life, but I've learned enough to know that most people have their own problems to worry about." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, absently skipping stones across the surface of the creek while he considered his response. "You remind me of someone," he said finally. "Someone who deserved better than what life handed her." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt a surge of sympathy for whatever loss had put that haunted look in his eyes. "Your wife?" she asked gently. "My wife." Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. "Rebecca. She died 3 years ago, along with our unborn child. If I had been there. If I had helped her instead of letting pride and stubbornness get in the way." He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah could fill in the implications. Whatever had happened to Rebecca Crawford, Daniel blamed himself for not preventing it. The guilt was eating at him, driving him to watch over other vulnerable women in a futile attempt to atone for his perceived failure. "I'm sorry," Sarah said simply, understanding now why he had been watching her homestead with such protective intensity. "But you can't save everyone, Daniel. And you can't blame yourself for tragedies that were beyond your control. Can't I?" Daniel's smile was bitter. "Rebecca wanted to homestead, just like you're doing. I told her it was too dangerous, that we should wait until we could afford to hire men to help with the building. She said she could handle it, that she was strong enough to do the work. I let my pride convince me she was right, instead of admitting that some jobs are too big for one person, no matter how determined they are. The parallel to her own situation was uncomfortable clear, and Sarah felt a chill of premonition. What happened to her? Cabin raising, Daniel said flatly. She was trying to lift a roof beam by herself when the support gave way. The beam fell, and the injuries were too severe. She lingered for 3 days before the fever took her. Sarah stared at him in horror, suddenly understanding the real reason. He had offered to help with her construction project. He wasn't just being neighborly, he was trying to prevent her from suffering the same fate as his wife. "That's why you're here," she said quietly. "You're afraid I'll hurt myself trying to raise the roof alone." Daniel nodded without meeting her eyes. Roof construction is the most dangerous part of building a cabin. The beams are heavy, the work is done at height, and everything depends on having the right support in place at exactly the right moment. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and he didn't need to finish. Sarah could imagine the scene all too clearly, herself struggling with a heavy beam high above the ground, the wood slipping from tired hands, the crushing weight falling with inexorable finality. She shuddered at the mental image. "So you've been watching me for weeks, waiting for me to reach the point where I would need help whether I wanted it or not," she said. "Partly yes, but also because I was curious about the woman who had the courage to try something that intimidates most men. You have to understand, Sarah, what you're attempting is remarkable. Most women in your situation would have given up and gone home weeks ago." The use of her first name felt natural and comfortable, marking a subtle shift in their relationship. From formal strangers to something approaching friendship. Sarah found that she liked the way Daniel said her name, with a warmth that suggested genuine respect rather than condescension. "I couldn't go home," she said simply. "There was nothing left for me there except humiliation and pity. At least here, if I fail, it will be because the task was beyond my abilities, not because someone else decided I wasn't worth keeping." Daniel studied her face with new understanding. "The betrayal you mentioned yesterday, someone broke your heart badly enough to drive you out here alone. Thomas Brennan." The name still tasted bitter in Sarah's mouth. "My fiancé, so I thought. He wrote to me for months, promising marriage and a life together. When I arrived to claim my future, I discovered he had married someone else while I was traveling to meet him. His loss," Daniel said with quiet conviction. "Any man fool enough to break faith with a woman like you doesn't deserve the happiness he threw away." The simple statement, delivered without flowery compliments or elaborate sympathy, somehow meant more to Sarah than all the kind words she had received from Martha Henderson and the other townspeople. Coming from a man who clearly understood loss and betrayal himself, it carried a weight of sincerity that she had rarely encountered. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. That helps more than you might realize." They returned to work with a new understanding between them, the shared confidences having created a bond of trust that made their collaboration even more effective. Daniel's expertise combined with Sarah's careful attention to detail proved to be an ideal partnership, and by evening they had made remarkable progress on the cabin walls. "We might actually finish the walls tomorrow," Daniel said as they surveyed their work by the light of the campfire. "Then we can start on the roof frame." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness at the mention of roof construction, knowing now just how dangerous that phase of the project would be. Will you stay to help with that part as well?" "If you want me to, yes." "I won't lie to you, Sarah, the roof is where everything gets complicated. The measurements have to be exact, the joints have to be perfect, and the timing of the actual beam placement is critical. But with 2 people working together, it's manageable." "And if Bull Garrett's gang shows up while we're in the middle of construction?" Daniel's expression grew serious. "That's the risk we're taking by not running." But I'd rather face them from inside a completed cabin than try to fight them off from a tent in the open. That night, as Sarah lay in her bedroll listening to the familiar sounds of the frontier darkness, she found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. 3 months ago, she had been a naive young woman dreaming of romantic love and domestic bliss. Now she was a pioneer woman with calloused hands and rifle skills, building a cabin with the help of a widowed cowboy who understood loss as intimately as she did. The transformation was far from complete. The most dangerous phases of construction still lay ahead, and the threat of outlaw revenge loomed over everything they were building. But for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Sarah felt like she was part of something larger than her own stubborn determination. She had a partner who understood both her capabilities and her limitations, someone who could help her achieve goals that might otherwise prove impossible. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather that felt like a gift from Providence. Sarah and Daniel worked steadily through the day, adding course after course of logs to the cabin walls. Their technique had evolved into something approaching artistry. Daniel would measure and notch each log with practiced precision, while Sarah prepared the chinking material that would seal the gaps and keep out the winter wind. "You're getting good at this," Daniel observed as he watched Sarah carefully fit a piece of chinking into place. "Most people just stuff mud and moss into the gaps and call it good, but you're taking the time to do it properly. If I'm going to spend the winter in this cabin, I want it to be as tight and warm as possible," Sarah replied. "No sense in doing a job halfway." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, and both of them tensed as they recognized the all-too-familiar pattern of multiple riders moving with purpose. Daniel's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle while Sarah counted the dust clouds rising from the direction of the creek. "4 riders," she said quietly. "Think it's them? Could be. Or it could be travelers passing through. Either way, we'd better be ready." They took defensive positions behind the partially completed cabin walls, weapons ready but not openly threatening. As the riders came into view, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and concern. These were not the rough outlaws she had been expecting. But they weren't exactly friendly neighbors either. The leader was a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, while his 3 companions had the look of professional gunmen. Their clothes were expensive but practical, and their weapons were well maintained and easily accessible. These were not common criminals like Bull Garrett's crew, but they were definitely dangerous. "Miss Mitchell," the leader called out as they approached the cabin site. "My name is Marcus Slade. I believe we need to have a conversation." Sarah felt her blood chill at the name. Marcus Slade was notorious throughout the territory as a land speculator who used violence and intimidation to acquire property at below-market prices. If he had come to her homestead, it meant her troubles were far from over. "Mr. Slade," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "This is my property, legally claimed and properly filed. I can't imagine what we would have to discuss." Slade smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Oh, I think you'll find we have quite a lot to discuss, Miss Mitchell." "Quite a lot indeed." Daniel shifted slightly beside her, and Sarah realized that whatever was coming next, the relative peace of their cabin building partnership was about to be shattered by forces beyond their control. Marcus Slade dismounted from his expensive bay, gelding with the fluid grace of a man who had spent decades in the saddle. But there was nothing of the honest cowboy about him. His tailored coat and polished boots spoke of wealth and influence, while the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes marked him as a predator of a different breed than Bull Garrett's crude gang. This was a man who conquered through contracts and corrupted courts rather than gunpowder and threats. "Impressive work you've done here, Miss Mitchell," Slade said, his cultured voice carrying just a hint of condescension as he surveyed the half-completed cabin. "Though I have to say, it seems like an enormous amount of effort for what will ultimately prove to be a temporary arrangement." Sarah kept her rifle at the ready, but didn't point it directly at the visitors. Something about Slade's manner suggested that he was not planning immediate violence, but she had learned not to trust appearances when it came to dangerous men. "Temporary?" she asked. "This is my homestead, Mr. Slade. I filed my claim properly, and I'm fulfilling all the requirements for ownership. There's nothing temporary about it." Slade's smile was the sort that might have been charming on a less predatory face. "Oh, my dear woman, I'm afraid you've been operating under some serious misconceptions about the legal status of this land. You see, your homestead claim conflicts with a prior grant that was issued to my company 3 years ago." Daniel stepped forward, his weathered face grim with understanding. "That's a lie, Slade. This land was surveyed and marked as available for homesteading. Sarah's claim is legal and valid." "Mr. Crawford, isn't it?" Slade's tone became noticeably cooler as he recognized Daniel. "I should have known you'd turn up eventually. Still playing the protector of helpless women, I see." The insult stung, but Daniel kept his temper under control. "I'm protecting a neighbor from a land-grabbing snake who uses legal technicalities to steal from honest settlers." "Legal technicalities?" Slade laughed, reaching into his coat to withdraw a folded document. "I prefer to call them proper documentation. This is a territorial grant deed, signed by Governor Campbell himself, giving my Wyoming Development Company full ownership of this entire valley." Sarah felt her heart sink as Slade unfolded the official-looking paper. The document appeared genuine, complete with elaborate seals and signatures, and if it was authentic, it would invalidate her homestead claim entirely. "Let me see that," Daniel said, extending his hand toward the document. "I'm afraid not," Slade replied, refolding the paper and returning it to his coat. "This is a valuable legal document, not something to be handled by every person who questions its authenticity. But I can assure you that it's been properly filed with the Territorial Land Office and takes precedence over any subsequent homestead claims." "Even if that's true," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "it doesn't give you the right to force me off land I've been improving for weeks. The law requires proper notice and legal proceedings." "Oh, but you're wrong about that, Miss Mitchell," Slade said with obvious satisfaction. "You see, by building on land that legally belongs to my company, you've been committing trespass. I would be within my rights to have you arrested and your illegal structures removed immediately." One of Slade's gunmen, a lean man with cold eyes and a tied-down holster, spoke up for the first time. "Want me to ride to town and fetch the sheriff, Mr. Slade?" "That won't be necessary, Jackson," Slade replied smoothly. "I'm sure Miss Mitchell is a reasonable woman who will see the wisdom of resolving this matter without involving the law." The threat was clear enough. Sarah had heard stories about Marcus Slade's methods, how he used bought judges and corrupt officials to legitimize his land grabs, leaving his victims with no legal recourse. Fighting him in court would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately futile. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Slade?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded hearing the answer. "I'm prepared to be generous," Slade said, his tone suggesting he considered this a magnanimous offer. "I'll pay you $50 for the improvements you've made to the property, the cleared land, the foundation work, the materials you've gathered. That's more than fair compensation for a few weeks of amateur construction." $50? Sarah's voice rose in indignation. "I've spent more than that on supplies alone, not counting the weeks of backbreaking work. This cabin will be worth 10 times that amount when it's finished." "But it won't be finished, will it?" Slade's smile turned predatory. "Because you'll be leaving. The only question is whether you leave with $50 in your pocket or nothing at all." Daniel had remained silent during this exchange, but Sarah could see the tension building in his shoulders. She recognized the signs from her brief time knowing him. Daniel Crawford was a man with strong protective instincts and a deep hatred of bullies. The combination of Slade's threats and his own guilt over Rebecca's death was pushing him toward a confrontation that could only end badly. And if I refuse your generous offer? Sarah asked, buying time while she tried to think of alternatives. Then, I'm afraid you'll discover just how unpleasant it can be to fight Wyoming Development Company in the territorial courts. Slade replied, We have excellent lawyers, Miss Mitchell, and they've never lost a case involving illegal squatters. Squatters? Daniel's voice carried a dangerous edge. This woman filed a legal homestead claim and has been fulfilling every requirement for ownership. She's no squatter. Slade turned his attention to Daniel with obvious disdain. And what exactly is your interest in this matter, Crawford? Are you Miss Mitchell's husband, her brother? Or are you just another drifter who's taken it upon himself to interfere in business that doesn't concern him? The casual dismissal was clearly intended to provoke Daniel into doing something rash, and Sarah could see that it was working. Daniel's hand had moved closer to his gun, and the three men with Slade had noticed the movement. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, with violence seeming increasingly inevitable. Mr. Crawford is helping me with construction, Sarah said quickly, hoping to diffuse the growing tension. And Mr. Slade, I need time to consider your offer. Surely you can understand that this is a major decision for me. Of course, Slade agreed, though his tone suggested he considered the outcome a foregone conclusion. Take all the time you need, say 24 hours. I'll return tomorrow evening for your answer. And if armed men show up in the meantime? Daniel asked pointedly. What armed men would those be, Mr. Crawford? Slade's expression was a picture of innocence. I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about. The denial was obviously false. Slade would have heard about Bull, Garrett's death, and the promised revenge from the remaining gang members. The fact that he was pretending ignorance suggested he might be planning to use the outlaw threat to his advantage. Just understand this, Slade, Daniel said quietly. If any harm comes to Miss Mitchell or her property, I'll hold you personally responsible. Is that a threat, Mr. Crawford? Slade's voice remained pleasant, but his eyes had gone cold. It's a promise. For a moment, the two men faced each other across a gulf of mutual hostility that seemed to charge the air between them. Then Slade smiled and remounted his horse with the same fluid grace he had shown in dismounting. 24 hours, Miss Mitchell, he said, touching his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. I trust you'll make the right decision. The four riders departed as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving Sarah and Daniel alone beside the half-completed cabin. The silence that followed their departure was heavy with unspoken fears and difficult choices. Is his claim legitimate? Sarah asked finally, voicing the question that had been tearing at her since Slade produced his document. Daniel ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that Sarah was beginning to recognize as a sign of deep frustration. It might be. Slade's got connections throughout the territorial government, and he's not above forging documents when it suits his purposes. But proving forgery would take months of legal battles, and by then I'd be ruined financially and he'd have possession of the land, Sarah finished. Even if I eventually won in court, I'd have lost everything that mattered. That's his strategy, Daniel confirmed grimly. He doesn't need to win legally, he just needs to make fighting him so expensive and time-consuming that people give up. Sarah sank down on a stack of lumber, suddenly feeling the weight of all the challenges she faced. Bull Garrett's gang was planning revenge, Marcus Slade was using legal manipulation to steal her land, and winter was approaching with merciless certainty. The cabin that had seemed so achievable just hours earlier now felt like an impossible dream. Maybe I should take his $50 and go back to town, she said quietly. At least then I'd have something to show for all this work. Is that what you want to do? Daniel asked, his voice carefully neutral. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the cabin walls that represented weeks of backbreaking labor and stubborn determination. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed to achieve, was being threatened by forces beyond her control. The smart thing to do would be to cut her losses and start over somewhere else. But the smart thing wasn't always the right thing. "No," she said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I didn't come this far to give up because some well-dressed thief wants to steal my land. This is my home, Daniel. I built it with my own hands, and I'm not going to let Marcus Slade take it away from me." Daniel's smile was the first genuine expression of happiness she had seen from him since they met. "Good, because I have an idea about how to fight back." "What kind of idea?" "The kind that's probably going to get us both killed," Daniel admitted. "But it might also save your homestead and put Slade out of business permanently." Sarah studied his face, seeing the determination that matched her own burning in his gray eyes. "I'm listening." "Slade's weakness is his reliance on corruption and intimidation. He's used to dealing with isolated settlers who have no resources to fight back. But what if we could expose his methods to someone who has the power to stop him?" "Who did you have in mind?" "Judge William Harrison. He's the new territorial judge, appointed directly by Washington. Slade hasn't had time to corrupt him yet, and Harrison has a reputation for honesty. If we could get proof of Slade's illegal activities... How do we get proof?" Sarah asked. "And how do we survive long enough to present it?" Daniel's expression grew grim. "That's where things get complicated. We'd need to catch Slade in the act of something obviously illegal, forging documents, bribing officials, ordering violence against settlers. And we'd need to do it without getting ourselves killed in the process. So we set a trap," Sarah said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "We make him think he's won, then catch him when he reveals his true methods." "Exactly. But Sarah, you need to understand what you'd be risking. If this goes wrong, you could lose everything: your land, your cabin, possibly your life. Slade doesn't hesitate to eliminate people who threaten his operations." Sarah looked again at her half-built cabin, thinking of all the dreams and hope she had invested in its walls. Then she thought of Thomas Brennan's betrayal, of the humiliation and helplessness she had felt when she discovered his deception. She had sworn never to be a victim again, never to let someone else's greed or cruelty destroy what she had built. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Daniel's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Sarah would appear to accept Slade's offer, but she would demand a proper contract and legal documentation of the sale. This would force Slade to reveal the specific methods he used to legitimize his land grabs, methods that would almost certainly involve fraud, forgery, or corruption. "He'll want to close the deal quickly," Daniel explained as they worked out the details. "Men like Slade get nervous when legitimate authority might start asking questions. If we can record his admissions or get copies of his forged documents, we'd have evidence that even a corrupt court couldn't ignore." Sarah finished. The plan was dangerous, requiring Sarah to meet with Slade alone while Daniel positioned himself to witness and document whatever illegal activities occurred. But it offered the only realistic chance of defeating an enemy who had successfully used the law as a weapon against honest settlers. As the afternoon wore on, they continued working on the cabin while refining their strategy. The normalcy of the construction work provided a strange counterpoint to the deadly serious planning. But Sarah found that the familiar rhythm of building helped her think more clearly. "There's something else we need to consider," Daniel said as they fitted another log into place. "Bo Garrett's gang. They could show up at any time, and if they arrive while we're in the middle of dealing with Slade... we'll be caught between two sets of enemies," Sarah said. "That's not a situation I want to be in. Which is why we need to finish this cabin as quickly as possible. A completed structure with good defensive positions might be the difference between life and death if things go wrong." The urgency of their situation lent new energy to their work, and by evening they had completed the cabin walls to the point where only the roof remained. The structure was beginning to look like a real home rather than a construction project, and Sarah felt a surge of pride despite all the uncertainties that lay ahead. "Tomorrow we start on the roof frame," Daniel said as they surveyed their progress by firelight. "It's the most dangerous part of the construction, but also the most important. Once we get the roof on, you'll have a defensible position that can withstand almost anything. And if Slade shows up while we're balanced on roof beams 20 feet above the ground," Daniel's smile was grim, "then we'd better make sure our trap works perfectly the first time." As Sarah settled into her bedroll that night, she found herself thinking about the strange turns her life continued to take. Tomorrow she would either secure her future as an independent homesteader or lose everything she had worked to build. The outcome would depend on her ability to outmaneuver a man who had spent years perfecting the art of legal theft. But for the first time since Marcus Slade had appeared with his threats and forged documents, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. She was no longer the naive woman who had trusted Thomas Brennan's promises or the frightened bride who had been abandoned at a train station. She had become someone stronger, someone who could stand up to bullies and fight for what was rightfully hers. The final confrontation was coming, and Sarah Mitchell intended to be ready for it. The first light of dawn found Sarah Mitchell and Daniel Crawford already at work, their movements urgent with the knowledge that this day would determine the fate of everything they had built together. The cabin walls stood complete and solid, but without a roof, the structure remained vulnerable to both weather and enemies. Today, they would attempt the most dangerous phase of construction, raising the heavy roof beams that would crown their weeks of labor. "Remember what I told you about the sequence," Daniel said as they prepared the first of the massive ridge beams. "We get the center beam in place first, then work outward from there. Each beam has to be perfectly positioned before we can release the tension on the ropes." Sarah nodded, checking her grip on the rope and pulley system they had rigged the previous evening. The contraption looked fragile compared to the weight it would be asked to bear, but Daniel had assured her it would hold if operated correctly. The key was timing. Any mistake in coordination could bring tons of timber crashing down on their heads. "Just like we practiced," she said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. The memory of Rebecca Crawford's death hung heavy in the air between them, an unspoken reminder of what could go wrong when roof construction was attempted without proper preparation. They had worked through the previous evening preparing for this moment, carefully measuring and marking each beam, positioning the supporting posts that would bear the weight during construction, and rehearsing every step of the process until they could perform it with their eyes closed. But practice with lighter materials was different from handling the massive timbers that would actually support the roof. The morning air was crisp and still, perfect conditions for the delicate work ahead. Any wind would make it nearly impossible to control the heavy beams as they swung through the air, and even a momentary gust could turn the construction process into a deadly disaster. "On my count," Daniel called from his position at the opposite end of the ridge beam. 1.2.3. "Lift." Sarah threw her weight against the rope, feeling the beam begin to rise as their carefully rigged pulley system took hold. The timber was heavier than anything she had ever attempted to move, but the mechanical advantage of the pulleys made it manageable, barely inch by inch. The massive beam rose toward its final position at the peak of the cabin's frame. Sarah's muscles strained against the weight, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool morning air. 20 feet below, the ground seemed very far away, and she tried not to think about what would happen if the rope slipped from her hands. "Steady," Daniel called out, his voice calm despite the enormous physical effort he was exerting. "Almost there. Just a few more inches." The beam settled into its mounting brackets with a solid thunk that seemed to echo across the entire valley. Sarah felt a surge of relief and accomplishment as she secured her end of the rope. They had successfully positioned the most critical structural element of the roof without injury or accident. "That's the hardest one," Daniel said, breathing heavily as he climbed down from his perch on the cabin's frame. "The rest should go easier now that we have the center beam to work from." But even as he spoke, Sarah caught sight of movement on the ridge overlooking their valley. A line of riders was silhouetted against the morning sky, too distant to identify but clearly heading in their direction. Her heart sank as she counted at least 6 horsemen, too many to be casual travelers, and the purposeful way they moved suggested hostile intent. "Daniel," she said quietly, pointing toward the approaching riders. He followed her gaze and cursed under his breath. Could be Slade returning early, or it could be Garrett's gang. Either way, we need to make a decision fast. Do we try to finish the roof, or do we prepare for a fight? Sarah looked at the partially completed structure, then at the approaching riders who were now less than a mile away. They had perhaps 20 minutes before the horsemen reached the cabin. Not nearly enough time to complete the roof, even if they worked with desperate haste. "We fight," she said firmly. "This cabin is the strongest defensive position we're likely to get, roof or no roof. At least the walls will stop bullets." They scrambled to gather their weapons and take positions behind the solid log walls they had so carefully constructed. Sarah's rifle was loaded and ready, with additional cartridges laid out within easy reach. Daniel had positioned himself at the opposite corner of the cabin, where he could cover the approaches from the creek while she watched the main trail dot. As the riders drew closer, Sarah was able to make out more details. These were not Marcus Slade's well-dressed gunmen, but the rough characters she had expected from Bull Garrett's gang. The leader was a man she didn't recognize, a lanky figure with long hair and the cold eyes of a professional killer. Behind him rode 5 other men, all armed and obviously intent on violence. "You Sarah Mitchell?" The leader called out as they reined in their horses just beyond rifle range. "Name's Jake Sutter. I rode with Bull Garrett, and I'm here to settle accounts for what you done to him." "Bull Garrett got what he deserved," Sarah called back, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He came here threatening an innocent woman, and he paid the price for his mistake." Sutter laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "Innocent? Lady, you killed one of the best men I ever knew. That ain't something we can let slide, even if you are just a woman." "Then I guess you'll have to try to do something about it," Sarah replied. "But I warn you, I'm not the helpless victim Bull thought I was." "We'll see about that," Sutter said, signaling to his men to spread out. "Boys, let's show this uppity bitch what happens when she messes with the Garrett gang." The attack began with a volley of rifle fire that sent splinters flying from the cabin walls, but failed to penetrate the solid timber construction. Sarah returned fire immediately, her first shot taking one of the outlaws in the shoulder and spinning him from his horse. Daniel's rifle cracked a moment later, and another attacker fell to the ground clutching his leg. But 6-2 odds were almost impossible to overcome, even with the advantage of defensive positions. The outlaws quickly adapted their tactics, using their superior numbers to keep up a continuous barrage of gunfire while working their way closer to the cabin. Sarah could hear bullets thudding into the logs just inches from her head, and she knew it was only a matter of time before one of the attackers found a gap in their defenses. "We need to break up their attack," Daniel called out during a brief lull in the shooting. "If they get close enough to rush us from multiple directions, ... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah understood the tactical situation perfectly. They were holding their position for now, but they couldn't maintain their defense indefinitely against superior numbers. That was when Sarah made a decision that would have horrified her former self but felt perfectly natural to the woman she had become. "Cover me," she called to Daniel, then sprinted from her defensive position toward the unfinished roof frame. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Daniel shouted, his voice filled with alarm. "Something crazy," she replied, scrambling up the ladder they had left leaning against the cabin wall. "Keep them busy for a minute." Daniel poured rapid fire at the attacking outlaws, forcing them to take cover and buying Sarah the time she needed to reach the top of the cabin's frame. From her elevated position, she could see the entire battlefield spread out below her, And more importantly, she had a clear shot at targets that were hidden from Daniel's ground-level position, the roof beam they had so carefully positioned that morning provided perfect cover as Sarah settled into a firing position 20 feet above the ground. Her first shot from this new angle caught Jake Sutter completely by surprise, the bullet taking him center mass and dropping him from his horse like a stone. The sudden loss of their leader threw the remaining outlaws into confusion, and Sarah pressed her advantage ruthlessly. Her elevated position gave her the ability to engage targets that thought themselves safely hidden, and her accurate shooting quickly tipped the balance of the fight. Within minutes, 3 of the attackers were down, and the other 2 were retreating toward the creek with bullets whistling around their ears. One of them was shouting something about crazy women and cursed homesteads, but Sarah couldn't make out the exact words over the sound of pounding hoofbeats. "Are you hit?" Daniel called up to her as the gunfire died away. "I'm fine," Sarah replied, though her hands were shaking with reaction to the violence. "Just give me a minute to get down from here." The climb down from the roof frame seemed much more dangerous than the ascent, partly because her muscles were weak with exhaustion, and partly because the reality of what she had just done was beginning to sink in. She had killed at least 2 men and wounded others, all while balanced precariously on a half-finished roof 20 feet above the ground. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish," Daniel said as he helped her down. "The last few feet of the ladder." "Probably both," Sarah admitted, her voice still shaky with adrenaline. "But it worked." They spent the next hour checking on the wounded outlaws and securing the area around the cabin. 3 of the attackers were dead, including Jake Sutter, while 2 others were wounded but alive. The remaining pair had fled and were unlikely to return without significant reinforcements. "That should end the threat from Garrett's gang," Daniel said as they surveyed the battlefield. "Without their leader and with half their numbers down, the survivors won't have the stomach for another attack." "Good," Sarah said firmly. "I'm tired of being threatened by men who think they can take whatever they want." But even as they dealt with the immediate aftermath of the attack, both of them were aware that their troubles were far from over. Marcus Slade would return that evening, expecting an answer to his ultimatum, and they still needed to complete the roof before winter weather made further construction impossible. "We should get back to work," Sarah said, looking up at the partially completed roof frame. "We've lost most of the morning, and we still have a lot of beams to position." Daniel nodded, though he looked at her with something approaching awe. "Sarah, what you did up there. Most men wouldn't have had the courage to try something like that." "Most men wouldn't have been desperate enough," she replied pragmatically. "Sometimes the crazy option is the only one that works." They returned to the roof construction with renewed urgency, knowing that every minute counted. The attack had proven that their cabin could serve as an effective fortress, but only if it was completed. A structure without a roof was still vulnerable to weather, fire, and enemies with enough patience to wait them out. The afternoon sun climbed higher as they worked through the complex process of positioning beam after beam. Sarah's confidence grew with each successful lift, her fear of heights gradually overcome by the satisfaction of watching their roof take shape. The mechanical advantage of their pulley system made the heavy work manageable, while their carefully rehearsed coordination prevented the kind of accidents that had claimed Daniel's wife. By late afternoon, they had successfully positioned all the major structural beams, transforming their cabin from a roofless shell into something that looked like a genuine home. The rafters stretched from ridge to wall in perfect parallel lines, ready to support the wooden shingles that would provide the final barrier against wind and weather. "We did it," Sarah said, looking up at their completed roof frame with a mixture of exhaustion and pride. "It's actually starting to look like a real house." "It's more than that," Daniel replied, his voice carrying an emotion that Sarah couldn't quite identify. "It's proof that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what the odds." As the sun began to set behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. Sarah and Daniel stood together admiring their handiwork. The cabin that had begun as an impossible dream was now a solid reality, built through weeks of backbreaking labor and defended through multiple attacks by those who would destroy it. But their sense of accomplishment was tempered by the knowledge that the greatest test still lay ahead. Marcus Slade would arrive soon expecting submission, and he would not be pleased to discover that his intimidation tactics had failed. The legal battle for the homestead was just beginning, and Sarah would need every bit of the courage and determination she had developed over the past weeks. "Whatever happens with Slade," she said quietly, "I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done. I couldn't have built this place without your help." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the fading light. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said weeks ago." But before he could continue, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted him. Marcus Slade was returning for his answer, and the final confrontation was about to begin. "Later," Sarah said, checking her rifle one more time. "Right now, we have a land grabber to deal with." As Slade and his men rode into the clearing, Sarah felt a calm determination settle over her. She had built this cabin with her own hands, defended it against outlaw attacks, and proven that Sarah Mitchell was no longer the helpless woman who had been abandoned at a train station. Whatever Marcus Slade had planned, he was about to discover that his intimidation tactics wouldn't work on someone who had already faced down death to protect what was hers. The roof was raised, the walls were solid, and Sarah Mitchell was ready for whatever came next. Marcus Slade's expression darkened considerably as he surveyed the scene that greeted him in Sarah's clearing. The bodies of 3 dead outlaws lay scattered around the cabin site, while 2 wounded men sat bound and guarded near the creek. Most disturbing of all from his perspective was the nearly completed cabin that stood where he had expected to find a frightened woman ready to accept his terms. "Miss Mitchell," Slade said, his cultured voice carrying a sharp edge of displeasure, "it appears you've been having an eventful day. I trust these unfortunate circumstances haven't affected your decision regarding my generous offer?" Sarah stood confidently beside her completed cabin, the rifle in her hands no longer seeming out of place against her frontier clothing. The transformation from abandoned bride to competent homesteader was complete, and it was evident in every line of her posture. "Actually, Mr. Slade, recent events have helped clarify my thinking considerably," she replied. "I've decided to accept your offer, but with certain conditions." Slade's eyebrows rose in surprise. He had expected either complete capitulation or defiant refusal, not negotiation from a position that seemed to assume equality. "Conditions? I'm afraid you misunderstand the nature of our arrangement, Miss Mitchell. I made you an offer out of generosity. There are no conditions to discuss." "Oh, but I think there are," Sarah said smoothly, following the script she and Daniel had rehearsed. "You see, if I'm going to sell my improvements to your company, I'll need proper legal documentation. A bill of sale, a clear title transfer, and most importantly, proof that your company actually owns this land." Daniel stepped forward from his position beside the cabin, a leather portfolio in his hands. "Miss Mitchell has asked me to represent her interests in this transaction. Mr. Slade, I've prepared the necessary paperwork for your review." Slade's 3 gunmen shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the way this confrontation was developing. They had come expecting intimidation and possibly violence, not legal negotiations that might expose their employer's methods. "I hardly think such formalities are necessary," Slade said, his voice betraying the first hints of real concern. "This is a simple transaction between reasonable people." "Simple transactions require proper documentation," Sarah insisted. "Surely. A man of your business experience understands the importance of legal paperwork. I wouldn't want there to be any questions about the validity of our agreement later." The trap was perfectly baited. Slade could hardly refuse to provide legal proof of his ownership without revealing that his claims were fraudulent. But producing the forged documents would give Sarah and Daniel the evidence they needed to expose his entire operation. Slade's pale eyes darted between Sarah and Daniel, clearly calculating his options. His usual intimidation tactics weren't working against opponents who seemed genuinely unafraid of him, and the presence of multiple dead outlaws suggested that these particular settlers were more dangerous than they appeared. "Very well," he said finally, reaching into his coat to withdraw the territorial grant deed he had shown them the previous day. "Here is your proof of ownership. As you can see, it's properly signed and sealed by territorial authorities." Daniel accepted the document with the careful attention of someone examining a valuable artifact. He spread it out on a makeshift table formed by a stack of lumber, studying every detail with professional interest. "Fascinating," he murmured, pulling a magnifying glass from his portfolio. "Miss Mitchell, you might want to look at this. The signature here is quite remarkable." Sarah joined him at the table, playing her part with the wide-eyed interest of someone seeing official documents for the first time. "What am I looking at, Mr. Crawford?" "This signature purporting to be Governor Campbell's," Daniel said, his voice carrying the tone of an expert making an important discovery. "Notice the formation of the letters, particularly the C in Campbell. Now compare it to this authentic Campbell signature from a document I happen to have." He produced a second paper from his portfolio, a genuine territorial proclamation bearing the governor's actual signature. Even to Sarah's untrained eye, the differences were obvious once pointed out. The forged signature was close but not perfect, betraying the hand of someone who had copied the governor's name without truly understanding his writing style. "You're suggesting that document is fraudulent?" Slade asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I'm not suggesting anything," Daniel replied mildly. "I'm simply observing that these two signatures appear to have been written by different people. Of course, I'm sure there's a perfectly innocent explanation." Sarah had been watching Slade's men during this exchange, and she noticed that one of them, a nervous-looking gunman named Peters, was growing increasingly agitated. The man kept glancing toward the trail as if planning an escape, and his hand never strayed far from his weapon. "Perhaps we should discuss this matter privately," Slade said, clearly hoping to end the document examination before more discrepancies were discovered. "Oh, I don't think privacy is necessary," Sarah said brightly. "After all, this is a simple business transaction, isn't it? Nothing to hide from anyone." That was when Peters made his fatal mistake. Whether motivated by loyalty to his employer or fear of being implicated in forgery charges, he suddenly drew his gun and pointed it at Sarah. "Enough of this nonsense," he snarled. "We came here to buy this place cheap or take it for nothing. All this legal talk ain't changing nothing." The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged firearm, providing exactly the kind of incriminating admission that Sarah and Daniel had hoped to provoke. But Peters had also escalated the situation beyond the realm of legal maneuvering into immediate physical danger. Daniel's response was lightning fast. His own weapon cleared leather before Peters could fully aim, and the sound of the gunshot echoed across the valley like thunder. Peters spun around and collapsed, his unfired pistol tumbling into the dirt. "Anyone else want to threaten Miss Mitchell?" Daniel asked quietly, his smoking gun now trained on Slade's remaining gunmen. The other two hired guns slowly raised their hands, clearly having no desire to follow Peters' example. They were professionals who understood when the odds had shifted decisively against them. "You've made a serious mistake, Crawford," Slade said, his cultured facade finally cracking to reveal the cold fury beneath. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I have connections throughout the territorial government. I can have you both arrested for murder, theft, and conspiracy." "Really?" Sarah asked with apparent innocence. "Even with your forged documents and your gunman's confession of criminal intent?" I think Judge Harrison might be very interested to hear about your business methods, Mr. Slade. The mention of Judge Harrison's name had a visible effect on Slade. The territorial judge was one of the few officials in the region who couldn't be bought or intimidated, and his reputation for harsh sentences was well known throughout the frontier. Harrison won't hear anything, Slade said desperately. You have no proof of wrongdoing, and even if you did, you'd never live to present it. Actually, we have quite a lot of proof, Daniel said, producing a small recording device from his portfolio. This conversation has been documented in its entirety, including your employee's confession and your own threats of retaliation. The device was one of the new Edison phonographs, small enough to be portable, but sophisticated enough to capture clear recordings of conversations. Daniel had acquired it specifically for this operation, knowing that Slade's own words would provide the most damning evidence of his criminal activities. Slade stared at the recording device as if it were a venomous snake. The implications were clear. Not only had his forgery been exposed, but his threats and his gunman's confession had been preserved for presentation to legitimate authorities. You can't use that, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. It's not legal evidence. Perhaps not in a formal court proceeding, Daniel agreed. But it should be quite persuasive when played for Governor Campbell, Judge Harrison, and the territorial marshal. I suspect they'll be very interested to hear how you've been using forged documents bearing the governor's signature. The trap had sprung perfectly. Slade was caught between his exposed forgeries and the recorded evidence of his criminal conspiracy, with no viable escape route remaining. His empire of legal theft was crumbling around him, and he knew it. But Marcus Slade hadn't survived years in the dangerous business of land speculation without developing survival instincts. If he couldn't intimidate or corrupt his way out of this situation, he would have to eliminate the witnesses entirely. Jackson, he said quietly to his remaining gunman, I think it's time we ended this conversation permanently. Jackson was a professional killer who had worked for Slade for 3 years, and he understood the unspoken order. His hand moved toward his weapon with the fluid motion of someone who had killed many times before. But Sarah had been watching for exactly this development. Her rifle was already trained on Jackson before he could clear leather, and her shot took him center mass before his gun could rise to firing position. That's 2 of your men dead, Mr. Slade, she said calmly, working the lever action to chamber a fresh round. Do you want to try for 3? The remaining gunman immediately threw down his weapon and raised his hands high above his head. He had signed on to intimidate farmers and settlers, not to face down a woman who shot with deadly accuracy from impossible positions. Slade found himself completely alone, facing 2 determined opponents who had systematically dismantled his plans and exposed his criminal operation. For the first time in years, Marcus Slade was the one at a disadvantage, and the experience was both terrifying and infuriating. This isn't over, he said, his voice thick with hatred. You may have won this round, but I have resources you can't. Imagine, I'll destroy you both, and I'll take this land one way or another. No, Mr. Slade, Sarah said firmly. This is over. Your forged documents are exposed, your criminal conspiracy is recorded, and your hired guns are dead or captured. Your only choice now is whether you want to ride away and never come back, or whether you want to join your employees in facing territorial justice. Daniel stepped forward, the recording device still running. I'd choose carefully if I were you. Slade, Judge Harrison has a particular dislike for land grabbers who prey on honest settlers. For a long moment, Slade stood frozen in indecision, his mind racing through options that all led to the same conclusion: he was beaten. The woman he had expected to intimidate into submission had outmaneuvered him completely, and the man he had dismissed as a simple cowboy had proven to be a far more dangerous opponent than anticipated. This isn't justice, he said finally, his voice carrying the bitter tone of a man who had lost everything. You're nothing but vigilantes taking the law into your own hands. We're homesteaders defending our legal rights, Sarah corrected. The law is exactly what we're upholding, honest. Law, not the corrupted version you've been peddling. Slade looked around the clearing one last time, taking in the completed cabin, the evidence of successful defense against multiple attacks, and the determined faces of two people who had refused to be victims. His empire of fear and fraud had been built on the assumption that isolated settlers would be too weak and frightened to fight back effectively. Sarah, Mitchell, and Daniel Crawford had proven that assumption fatally wrong. Mount up, Slade ordered his surviving gunmen. We're leaving. And Mr. Slade, Daniel called out as they turned toward their horses, if we see you in this valley again, we'll assume you're here for violent purposes and act accordingly. The threat was clear and unambiguous. Slade's reign of terror in this part of the territory was finished, and any attempt to resume it would be met with deadly force from opponents who had already proven their willingness and ability to use violence. Effectively, as Slade and his remaining employee rode away into the gathering darkness, Sarah and Daniel stood together beside the cabin they had built and defended. The structure was more than just shelter now. It was a symbol of everything that could be accomplished when determination met opportunity, when justice confronted corruption, and when two people worked together toward a common goal. Is it really over? Sarah asked, hardly daring to believe that the threats that had dominated her life for weeks had finally been eliminated. The immediate danger is over, Daniel confirmed. Slade won't be back, and what's left of Garrett's gang will find easier targets elsewhere. Your homestead is safe, Sarah. You've won. But even as he spoke the words, Daniel realized that the victory brought with it a new challenge. Sarah no longer needed his protection or assistance with construction. The cabin was essentially complete. Her legal claim was secure, and her ability to defend herself had been proven beyond doubt. The partnership that had brought them together was ending, and Daniel wasn't sure what would replace it. What happens now? Sarah asked, as if reading his thoughts. It was the question that would determine not just the immediate future, but the entire direction of both their lives. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and possibility as Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway of her completed cabin, watching the sun set over the Wyoming valley that had become her home. 3 months had passed since Marcus Slade's defeat, and the homestead had transformed from a desperate survival project into something that looked like it had always belonged to this landscape. The cabin roof was now covered with hand-split shingles that Daniel had helped her install during the final weeks of construction. A stone chimney rose sturdy and straight, sending lazy spirals of smoke into the crisp evening air. The windows glowed with warm lamplight, and a small garden plot beside the house showed the stubble of harvested vegetables that would see her through the coming winter. But the most significant change wasn't in the buildings or the land, it was in Sarah herself. The frightened woman who had been abandoned at a train station had evolved into someone she barely recognized, confident, capable, and completely at peace with the choices that had brought her to this place. Daniel emerged from the barn where he had been tending to the horses they now kept together, his black stallion and her sturdy mare, along with a milk cow and several chickens that had been added to make the homestead more self-sufficient. His presence had become as natural and necessary as the sunrise, though they had never formally discussed the arrangement that had evolved between them. Judge Harrison's letter came today, Daniel said, holding up an official envelope that had arrived with the weekly mail delivery. The territorial court has officially invalidated all of Slade's fraudulent land grants. You're not the only homesteader who'll be getting clear title thanks to our evidence. Sarah accepted the letter with a mixture of satisfaction and relief. The legal victory was complete now, with no possibility of future challenges to her ownership. But more importantly, other families would be able to keep their homes and build their futures without fear of Slade's predatory schemes. What about Slade himself? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Fled to California, according to the marshal's report. Left behind enough debts and angry creditors to keep him busy for years, assuming he doesn't end up in prison first. Daniel's smile was grim with satisfaction. Either way, he won't be bothering honest settlers again. They walked together toward the cabin as the last light faded from the western sky, their footsteps perfectly synchronized after months of working side by side. The comfortable silence between them was filled with the unspoken understanding that had developed during their partnership, but also with the tension of questions that had never been directly addressed. Inside the cabin, Sarah moved with practiced efficiency to prepare their evening meal, while Daniel added wood to the fire that would keep them warm through the night. A domestic routine had evolved naturally over the weeks since the last of their enemies had been defeated, but both of them were aware that it existed in a kind of limbo that couldn't continue indefinitely. "Sarah," Daniel said finally, as they sat down to a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and preserved meat, "we need to talk about what happens next." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from the fireplace. Sarah had been dreading and anticipating this conversation in equal measure, knowing that the practical partnership that had brought them together would eventually need to become something more defined or come to an end. "I know," she said quietly. "You've done everything you promised and more. The cabin is finished, the threats are eliminated, and I can take care of myself now. You're free to go wherever you want." Daniel stared into his coffee cup as if it contained answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" Sarah felt her heart clench at the carefully neutral tone of his voice. Over the months they had worked together, she had come to depend on more than just his physical help with construction and defense. His quiet strength, his gentle humor, and his unwavering loyalty had become as essential to her daily life as food and shelter. But she had also learned the hard way not to assume that her feelings were reciprocated, not to build dreams on foundations that might prove as false as Thomas Brennan's promises. "I want you to be happy," she said carefully. "If staying here with me would make you happy, then nothing would please me more. But if you feel obligated to stay out of some misguided sense of duty—" "Duty?" Daniel's voice carried a note of surprise that made Sarah look up from her own meal. "Sarah, do you really think duty is what's kept me here all these months?" The intensity in his gray eyes made her pulse quicken with something that might have been hope. I wasn't sure. You've been so focused on protecting me, on making sure I could survive on my own. I thought maybe that was just who you are, someone who helps people and then moves on to help others." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man who had spent years keeping his deepest feelings locked away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The day I first saw you working on this cabin, struggling with logs that were almost too heavy to move but refusing to give up. That was the first time in 3 years that I felt anything besides guilt and emptiness. Watching you build something beautiful out of nothing, seeing you fight for what was yours. It reminded me that there were still things in this world worth protecting." Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. "And now? Now I know that what I thought was protection was really something else entirely. I wasn't just helping you build a home, Sarah. I was falling in love with the woman who had the courage to build it." The words she had hoped to hear but never dared expect hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Sarah reached across the table and took Daniel's calloused hand in hers, feeling the strength and gentleness that had helped her accomplish the impossible. "I love you too," she said simply. "I think I have since the day you helped me raise that first roof beam. But I was afraid to believe it could be real, afraid it was just gratitude or loneliness or ... It's real," Daniel interrupted gently. "More real than anything I've felt since Rebecca died. But Sarah, you need to understand, if we do this, if we build a life together, it won't be because you need rescuing or because I need someone to protect. It will be because we choose each other as equals." Sarah smiled through her tears, understanding exactly what he meant. She was no longer the abandoned bride who had arrived in Wyoming territory with nothing but disappointment and determination. She had become a woman who could stand on her own, who had built something lasting with her own hands, who had faced down killers and thieves and emerged victorious. "Equal partners," she agreed, "in everything." Daniel rose from his chair and moved around the table to kneel beside her, taking both her hands in his. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you need a husband to take care of you, but because I need a partner to share my life with." The proposal was everything that Thomas Brennan's letters had promised, but failed to deliver: honest, heartfelt, and based on genuine knowledge of who she really was rather than romantic fantasies about who she might become. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, Daniel Crawford, I will marry you. And I promise to be the kind of wife who builds alongside her husband, rather than one who simply waits to be taken care of." As Daniel kissed her there in the cabin they had built together, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come west as an abandoned bride seeking a new start, but she had found something far more valuable than the security she had originally wanted. She had found herself. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small church in Sweetwater Station, with Martha and Jake Henderson serving as witnesses and most of the town turning out to celebrate the marriage of the woman who had become something of a local legend. The bride who had been abandoned by one man had found true love with another, but more importantly, she had discovered that the most reliable foundation for happiness was the one she had built herself. Sarah Crawford, for that was her name, now stood beside her husband in the cabin they would share as partners in every sense of the word. The roof they had raised together sheltered not just their bodies, but their dreams, and the walls they had built with their own hands would protect not just their possessions, but their future. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the valley that had tested them and shaped them and ultimately brought them together. Inside, a fire burned warm and bright in the hearth they had built, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the home that would shelter their love for all the years to come. The abandoned bride had found her way home at last, not to a place that someone else had built for her, but to a life she had created through her own strength, courage, and determination. And in the arms of the man who had helped her raise her roof, she had found the only kind of love worth having, the kind that builds something lasting together, one beam at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.